But yeah, we essentially sit here for a minute or two before we get into the formal conversation, just to let some people hop on. It tells me, how many people are jumping on, and people are already jumping on. But just to remind the listeners, this is on Facebook, on my personal Facebook, my personal YouTube, Educational Freedom Institute YouTube, Educational Freedom Institute Facebook, and then my personal Twitter as well. Again, we all like school choice here. So we're going to extend that to the platforms as well. Take your choice. But yeah, so today we have Jay Greene, who, just a little fun fact, he was on the dissertation, my own dissertation committee over at the University of Arkansas. So we can thank him for approving my dissertation. That shoddy work.
I'll neither take credit nor blame. But actually, one of the things that's a real point of pride to me is the great diversity of people, perspectives, and approaches of our former students who've come out of our university. I think that's a really great thing. And not everyone's going to like everything that our alums have to say, or not everyone's going to think that it's done the right way or the way they would do it. But what I really like about our department is that we are very open, tolerant, accepting, and encouraging of our students, no matter what their views are, no matter what their approaches are. We just help them be what they want to be as effectively as they can be. And I think, Corey, you're a great example of that. But so are a lot of our other students who disagree with you. Yep. And I'm proud of all of you. So thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So it looks like we already have a large amount of people who've signed on. Jay, you're just attracting everybody. It's larger than usual. So thanks for joining us.
Sure.
But Matthew, if you can get to formal introductions, and then let's just hop into the conversation. Sounds like a good idea to me.
Okay, cool. So I'm Matthew Nielsen. I'm the board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute. Corey DeAngelis joins us, as always, every Monday and Friday, by the way. That's the way we've set it up now. So it's every Monday and Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, on those platforms that Corey talked about. Corey is the executive director at EFI. He's also the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Our special guest today is Dr. Jay Greene. And he is distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. He's the author of many works and publications and a school choice legend. So thanks for coming on, Jay. We really appreciate it. So I have to tell you, before we get started, I got to tell you this. We all know Matt Ladner. He's a good friend of ours, all of us. Great guy. And when I first met him, I was talking to him about just people in the space, and he had done research with and stuff like that. And your name came up, and he said, I'm trying to remember the exact words that he said about you, Jay. He said something like, you're the guru of school choice, and he learned at the feet of the master, or something like that.
Very nice. Well, I mean, look, actually, Matt was a student at the University of Houston. He was a doctoral student there, got his PhD there. And that was my first gig as a professor, was at the University of Houston. I'd like to say that he was my student, but as a matter of fact, I never had him in a class. He was there. I knew him there, but he was not actually my student. But we did overlap there way back when, and we were very early on in the school choice debate active. So Matt and I do go back a very long time.
That's cool. Well, this we're excited to have you on, and we want to. The way that I pitched this to you, Jay, and by the way, Jay also serves as a governing board member at the Educational Freedom Institute, and we're grateful for your service there, Jay. But so when I pitched this to you, coming on to the podcast with Corey and I said, just tell us what you're interested in talking about, and we'll talk about it. And you came back with, well, let's talk about how the current pandemic, the situation that everyone's in, is going to affect ed reform as a movement.
Right.
And I think that's a great question. It's an interesting question, and it's one that we'll talk about today. But in addition to that, we're going to get to some other parts of current events and other interesting questions that we kind of touched on a little before Corey pressed play on, or record, I should say. And we'll just let the conversation go where it takes us. But let's just start there. Let's start with, well, actually, we should start with you. Tell us about you, how you got interested in education, that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, I was in a doctoral program in political science at Harvard. My advisor was Paul Peterson. So my introduction to education reform and school choice began very early. But truth be told, when I was a PhD student, I did not study school choice or education because it just wasn't something that respectable political scientists did. And to some degree, education policy was neglected because it fell between the cracks of different disciplines. So economists at that time really didn't pay much attention to education policy. There were relatively few economics of education experts at that time. And political scientists thought that it was lowly policy and they didn't really want to dirty themselves with that. And then education professors, they weren't particularly interested in school choice because they were in the business of training teachers, and that industry was not very interested in spurring competition to their graduates. And so there was a real neglect of this topic. When Paul Peterson started the evaluation of the Milwaukee Voucher Program, he needed some help in analyzing the data. And we had collaborated before on some other projects, and he was my advisor. And he knew that I had the technical skills to help him with this. And so I really stumbled into doing education policy work and working on school choice a little bit by accident. And I have to tell you, I was eager to accept the offer because I really did believe in the importance of the issue and cared intensely about it. I just didn't know that I could do it until someone invited me to do it. And then once I started doing it, I haven't stopped. So I'm quite glad. And that was 3 decades ago, more than 3 decades ago, I guess. So the Milwaukee voucher evaluation was my first foray into education policy and school choice research. And then I've also evaluated other school choice programs like the Charlotte voucher experiment. I've been particularly interested from early on in how school choice affects non-test score outcomes, civic outcomes, tolerance, participation, volunteering, really, because I think those are some of the most important outcomes from education. People want a lot more for their kids out of schooling than just higher test scores. They do want their kids to learn rich content so that they can be effective in the economy, but they also want them to be decent human beings who are able to engage in civic society and in positive ways. And so I've always had this kind of broader understanding of what education was about. And I thought school choice would be an important part of helping people realize that diverse set of goals. And so one of the earliest publications I had on school choice after the Milwaukee voucher study was a study on civic outcomes from school choice.
So Jay, you talk a lot about, you've done a lot of this research for a long time on test score and non-test score outcomes. So like as a researcher, like what do you think is the main role of research in the school choice conversation? Should it be used to, determine what type of schools people should be able to pick, or, what is the main role of research?
Well, so I think researchers should be pretty humble about what our role is in policy discussions. We can help supply some information that can help people have discussions about policy better. but we can't determine the correct answer to policy debates. We're not smart enough. Our work isn't good enough. We are not broad enough in all of the questions that we can address. Our rigor is not high enough. All of these things make it so that it's inappropriate to have rule by social science expert. And I think a lot of people in my line of work think that somehow people are supposed to listen to them and obey what they have to say. And I don't think that. I'm amazed that people listen to me at all. I know a little bit, and I just try to add a little bit to conversation. So I think a lot of factual descriptive work is actually quite helpful. I know there's an obsession with causal identification in social science research. And frankly, I think much of it is fake. I think much of it doesn't really identify causal effects. Mm-hmm. The only thing I really believe identifies causal effects really is an actual experiment. And we just don't have those a lot. Mm-hmm. And even when we do have them, then we have external validity problems. That is, we have problems with whether we can generalize from our experiments to other situations. And so we're really quite limited in what we can say as social scientists about the truth of effective policy. We simply add information. I think a lot of what we can do is descriptive information, and then this is a political process, and people will have interests, and they have differing perspectives, and they have different values, and they're going to argue with each other, and they're going to sort it out in the normal political process, just like they should. And we contribute to that with information, and we also contribute to it with our own perspectives that we should be completely candid about. I have my own values. I have my own preferences. I try to be transparent about those things. It doesn't mean that the facts that I find are any more or less true because of my perspective, but everyone should understand that everyone in this debate has perspectives. There are no neuters, no disinterested objective players in this debate. We're all interested players because we're all human beings as part of our society. And so I do contribute, I think, some factual information to debates, but I also do contribute my own perspective and values.
So Jay, on a related topic, you were one of the first people, or if not the first person, to talk a little bit about this, the evidence for the disconnect between effects of programs on test scores and effects of those same programs on later life outcomes, or even just different outcomes contemporaneously. How does that relate to this idea of, using science and using, experiments on test scores to limit people's choices, and how this kind of plays into that conversation?
Sure. Well, first, I should really credit, it was Colin Hitt, my former student, who's now a professor at the Medical University at Southern Illinois, who first brought this to my attention. And so as it turns out, there is very weak relationship between rigorously identified gains in test scores and rigorously identified gains in other later life outcomes for students. And the reason why this is really important is that part of the enterprise to manage policy scientifically, that is the belief that social scientists should be obeyed by policymakers and by the public, and that we as social scientists know what good and effective education is, and everyone should defer to us, is the belief that we have access to certain information, certain tools that distinguish between good and bad policy in all respects. And look, I used to believe this. I mean, I confess that early on in my work, I thought that test scores correlated with everything else. That if test scores, if you did something in education that made test scores go up, probably every other good thing also went up. Right? Mm-hmm. Kids would also become more civically engaged. They would become nicer. I thought everything good would happen in sync because I thought there was a single underlying dimension of quality in education, and that test scores were an imperfect, but a proxy for this singular dimension of quality. But over time, and I think the evidence makes this clear, and I'm kind of disappointed in myself that I didn't realize it earlier, but it should be now fairly obvious that education policy, like most things, is multidimensional. That is, it has many different qualities, and there are trade-offs between those different qualities, and different people may legitimately have different preferences between those different qualities. Some people may value their kids learning economically useful skills more than learning civic engagement. Other people may value civic engagement more than economically useful skills. Some people may think being kind and empathetic is a really important skill and may value that more than they value test scores. But some people may feel the other way, and there is no correct answer to that. There is no scientifically correct answer, and therefore any attempt to manage schools scientifically with a single tool like test scores is going to obscure these trade-offs and oppress people who have legitimate differences in their priorities between these different goals of education. And so we've seen this over and over again, where interventions that improve test scores don't necessarily improve other outcomes in life, and vice versa, that other interventions that improve later outcomes in life don't necessarily improve test scores. And I don't know what the right trade-off is between those different goals, and ultimately it's a political dispute, and we're going to hash it out in a political process.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the examples I like to point out is just the most recent experimental evaluation, so we can be pretty sure it's causal, of the DC voucher program. Mm-hmm. In the first couple of years, they were finding negative effects on test scores. In the third year, they found no effects on test scores. But in all 3 years, there was some evidence, at least, of positive effects on reports of safety right. in that evaluation. So, like, even within the
and positive effects on attainment as well. High school graduation also was.
Yeah,
test scores weren't going up, but graduation was.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and then also other things like the attendance. There was, in the most recent evaluation, positive effects on attendance, and reports of certain types of satisfaction, and then obviously safety as well. So I find this argument about disconnects very convincing myself, because it could be that parents aren't really choosing all that much based on standardized test scores. Maybe they care more about the safety of their children, and maybe there's other things like these civic outcomes that are not measured, very, very well by math and reading test scores. And I think that's part of it.
And look, also different sectors are differently incentivized to attend to this particular measure of academic skill. So test scores don't just measure content knowledge, but they measure a specific set of content that traditional public schools are highly motivated and entirely geared towards producing. And the private schools, for example, in DC, have not been designed with the goal of maximizing outcomes on this one particular test. So not surprisingly, that's not something they excel at. That's because they don't care about it as much as their competitors. Now, if you're a parent who really cares about that test score, who really trusts that, then you should choose a school that does better on that outcome. But not everybody does, and that's why we have choice.
So, but what's the view? I mean, I'll let you lay it out. What's the view of the other side that why do you think some people are arguing that, well, we have this study showing negative effects on test scores, so therefore, people shouldn't be able to pick this for this reason or that reason? What do you think, drives that motivation, and what's your
I don't want to get into people's motives or analyze,
or at least their theory, maybe like one of their strongest theories.
I think their perspective is there are public dollars at stake, there are tax dollars at stake, and so we have to make some sort of collective judgment about whether those tax dollars are being used well or poorly. And so we need some measure of quality that would allow us to know whether tax dollars are being wasted or not. And saying that, well, this is just what parents prefer does not constitute might be wasteful to them, that they think that parents might want things that are illegitimate or socially undesirable. And therefore, the fact that parents choose it is not enough for them to see it as a good use of tax dollars.
So that, I think you're exactly right, but I want to ask this question because because I think it might take us a little deeper and maybe address even some more foundational issues potentially. But so here's the question: if government dollars, if tax dollars weren't used to fund systems, meaning the traditional public school system, and instead the same amount of money went to individual families for their use to fund their children's education, whatever way they chose, would that help to address that issue that you just brought up? That well, we can't measure quality in many ways, but the best way that we have is through test scores. And so we have,
which I don't believe, but some people do, right?
But some people do, and I think that's not necessarily their strongest argument, but it's one that is common. Right. So, what do you think? Does that help to address that in any way?
If we don't fund systems, if we just fund individuals, but the problem there is they think that if the individuals choose in ways that are not socially productive, are not socially beneficial.
Why would people choose schools with poor outcomes, Jay?
Well, so I guess that they think there could be trade-offs between what individuals prefer for themselves and what is good for society.
And so that's it right there, Jay.
Yeah.
Right. So in their own argument, now it's hard to get this far with someone that actually holds this view, because they'll stop you and say, well, I like you, I will try not to pass judgment or infer motives, but it's hard to get this far with someone that actually holds this view because they don't want to say out loud, this is okay. So I'll do it. I'll actually infer motives, but they don't want to say out loud that no, your approach, your values don't match up with what's best for society. And so we can't allow you to take taxpayer dollars and use them in the way that you see fit.
Right. I mean, while I look, there probably is some outer limit that most of us, maybe not Corey, but most of us would say, well, there's some point where an individual choice might be contrary to collective interest, and that's why we have laws that forbid people from doing certain things, because we believe it's sufficiently harmful to others that we forbid it. Now,
to be clear, I'm cool with laws and I'm cool with
limits. No, I'm just teasing. I'm teasing. But I just want to say that there is a limit here, and I think we kind of all recognize there's a limit. I just think that as an empirical reality, parents choosing education for their children is rarely, almost never, close to the limit of what we would probably find acceptable. It's not that we can't imagine it. We can imagine Nazi schools. We can imagine them, but they just don't happen. You can search high and low for them, and they just aren't out there. They could exist. Maybe they will exist or do exist every now and then. But frankly, you can have Nazis teaching their kids at home to be Nazis too. And, so there's some limit to how much we want to crack down on that too, because people are allowed to believe horrible things. we can only stop horrible actions. We can't stop horrible thoughts.
Right.
And so that's why I think that's not a, so the practical matter is that parents are very, very unlikely to choose these socially destructive things.
Yeah.
And so I don't see that as something that we really need to worry about very much.
So let's get into a little bit of the practical implications of, kind of these top-down accountability rules. You've written a lot about how these top-down accountability systems are structured and how they could lead to unintended consequences. For example, there's this article in Education Next, futile accountability systems should be abandoned. And I think you make some of those arguments there, but could you, go over for some of our listeners, some of the main arguments you make and, maybe even just give them a quick synopsis of what these accountability systems actually look like in practice and what happens.
So I mean, accountability systems are actually largely a bluff. That is, there is virtually no actual accountability in the traditional public sector. And if by accountability we mean that people are punished for poor outcomes. So almost no one loses their job. Almost no tenured teacher has been, of the 3.2 million people currently working as public school teachers, the number who will ever in their career lose their job for poor academic performance of their students is rounds to zero. I'm not saying it's exactly zero. There could be some, but it's really close to zero. And so if by accountability we mean a consequence to the adults in the education system for the outcomes of their students, there's virtually none. Instead, what we have is a series of processes and compliance measures where schools have to go through certain routines and report certain information and then receive certain labels and then respond to those labels with other processes and so on. But it really is all kind of double secret probation from Animal House. I mean, there's no consequence ultimately to any of this. And I think early on, in the accountability movement, this was not widely known. So people in the education system legitimately thought bad things were going to happen. They thought they were going to get fired, or some of their friends were going to get fired. They really thought it. And it scared them and motivated them to do things. Now, in some ways, it motivated them actually to be more effective. And there is some evidence that early on in the accountability movement, there were real improvements in student outcomes, in part, perhaps because of increased effort on the part of the adults in the education system, because they believed something bad was going to happen. Now, it's also true in the Soviet Union when they, set steel production goals and they threatened to, shoot people if they didn't meet their quotas. Steel production went up. These systems can improve productivity in the near term. But they have a hard time over the long term because in the Soviet Union, well, first, there's very little incentive to innovate, right? So you don't come up with new and better ways of doing things, and you also don't reset what your goal should be going forward. So there are those kinds of problems. But then there's also the problem that people begin to figure out, what can I get away with before they shoot me? Because you begin to discover, well, they're not going to shoot everybody. So people in the Soviet Union began to figure out how much they could slack off, and they began to develop relationships with the people who were supervising them anyway, and they work it out so that everyone agrees, let's have lower conflict, and the productivity increases begin to fade. So Soviet Union had remarkable economic growth in its first few decades, incredible, actually, such that it was legitimately seen as a model for economic development throughout much of the developing world, because they thought, look, that's a path to rapid growth. But then, as we saw in later decades, it was a path to economic stagnation, decline, and ultimately the destruction of the Soviet Union. I think the accountability story is essentially the same thing, because it's a central command system. There are centrally determined goals, just like in the GOS plan. We're going to have hit this amount of test scores by this date.
Yep.
And there are claimed consequences, but then everyone discovers it's a bluff. Everyone begins to slack off. Then we wonder, did we set the right goals? What about other goals? We can shift our energy away from producing other things towards skill, if skill's the big thing. So if test scores are the big thing, then we're going to cut arts classes, and we're going to cut music class, and we're going to cut PE. And don't say, oh, those things are the unimportant things about school, because they're not. To some people, they're the most important thing about school. And they really do help children, And different kids get different benefits out of school. Not everyone is like you. I think one of the problems in the ed reform movement is that we're mostly filled with people who did really well in school. And we liked school, and we were good at it, right?
Yeah.
And we think, oh, everyone should be just like us. But a lot of kids hate school. They hate it, and they're horrible at it. And finding ways for it to be a meaningful, productive experience for them is important. And compelling them to be like us is not a good path forward. And then when it goes poorly, our solution is, floggings will continue until morale improves. So we say, if test scores didn't go up enough, what we need, the solution to low test scores is more school. Let's have it all year round. Let's have longer days.
And more testing. Let's test more
testing,
often.
Right? Or but like school kids hate school and they're horrible at it. So the solution is let's do more of it. That's a good idea.
Well, yeah, it might be the field trip that's the most important part of the educational experience for some people.
Yeah, look, we did a whole bunch. I worked with a great team of people doing a whole bunch of experiments on what kids got out of going on different kinds of enriching field trips, like to art museums, seeing live theater, and I'm not saying that everyone has to do these things. Our part of our whole exercise was just to show kids get something out of those. Those aren't wastes of time. Now, how much you value the benefits of those field trips versus other things, that people have to sort out for themselves. I don't know what the correct answer is.
Right. Right.
Well, but I do want, if we have chance here, I do want to pivot to talking about the education reform movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think let's divide it into two different parts. So there's the education reform movement as the establishment of people who are employed to do this thing called education reform. The education reform movement that is the activity of changing and improving the quality of education for kids. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The activity of improving schools for kids, I think we've made great progress on that over time, and we're going to continue to make great progress on that over time. I think, slowly but surely that is likely to get better, independent of what we, education reform establishment, the people who work in that industry, regardless of what we do, we've been actually really bad at it. The ideas that we've come up with, that we've tried to foist on people to improve their schools, when they listen to us, they're as likely to be heard as helped. So that's what our failure book was about. This is the book that Mike McShane and I edited, was kind of reflecting on a lot of the different things that we've tried as an education reform movement and how many of them didn't pan out the way we thought. And we also have a bad habit of not pausing and reflecting on why things didn't pan out. And instead, we just want to rush ahead to the next thing to find something that works. And very often, by the way, we recycle back to the same old stuff, just with a new name. and we forget about why it didn't work last time. And we make the same mistakes over and over again. So there's nothing wrong with failing. We, as human beings, we're all going to fail a lot. But there is something wrong with failing and not learning from it. And the education reform movement oddly enough, has not been a learning movement. We don't learn. We make mistakes, and then we keep doing the same mistakes. So that's been discouraging. Now, the insight I've had during this pandemic is, look, we don't have a lot to show for ourselves as a movement. We don't have a lot of successes. There are a very small number of people who pay almost all of the bills for all of us to engage in this work, right? So there's the federal government and about 4 or 5 foundations that pay 80% of the salaries of the people who are in the education reform movement, okay? And what have these people bought for all their money? Not very much. In addition, and right now, they have some very pressing alternative demands on their resources. What are the odds going forward that they're going to want to keep pouring money into us? If I were them, if I were Bill Gates, why would I keep banging my head against this wall? He doesn't have much to show for his efforts in education. He's got a lot of failures to show for his efforts, and a lot of blame and criticism and acrimony, but if he were to shift gears and focus on vaccine development, he might be more successful, and he might also get more praise. It seems to me that he might very well move in that direction, which means that a whole bunch of people who spend their lives sitting around dreaming up how everyone else should educate their kids, all those people are going to be out of work here in a little while. And of course, I feel bad about that. I don't want anyone to be out of work. I want everyone to find meaningful and productive employment. But sometimes it has to be in some different activity, and it feels like that might start happening for some people in our field. I don't know if you guys are both in the same industry, so I don't know if you're awesome.
Do you think that's mostly because coronavirus could lead to recessionary pressures, which could?
Yeah, I think that the federal government, has just spent a whole lot of money on a bunch of things that were very pressing, trying to keep people fed and housed, and there's massive unemployment, and then there are all these demands for medical innovation, which are placing demands on both government and private foundation resources. It seems to me that they might focus on those very legitimate concerns rather than on this one that they've been working on for decades without much to show for their expenditures.
What about the whole small schools experiment that the Gates Foundation kind of looked at? I think they had a little bit of success there, right?
Yeah, they did. This was small schools of choice, actually. So in New York, they supported the effort of splitting large, failing high schools into multiple smaller schools housed within the same building. And then people could choose which of those smaller institutions, often thematically varied, they preferred. And so it's a little bit unclear whether the intervention there was the smallness of it or the choice part of it, or the fact that they brought in some new operators, maybe it was higher quality new operators that they brought in. So it's a little unclear exactly what does the heavy lifting, but they do know from a random assignment experiment that people who were given access to these small schools of choice by lottery fared better over long term than those who did not. So there was something very good that happened as a result of those small schools of choice in New York City that were created with support from the Gates Foundation. But the sad thing is the Gates Foundation abandoned that strategy even before the results of that experiment were known. In fact, when the results of that experiment were known, they didn't even put it on their website.
They had pivoted already, right?
They had pivoted already, so they weren't interested in promoting how effective the thing they had abandoned was.
Dang it.
So,
and didn't you highlight the latest results of their, whatever they were focusing on most recently? What was it? The
effective teachers,
the BENT project or something.
Well, I mean, look, to their credit, they do fund evaluations, and sometimes the evaluations show that things worked, and sometimes it shows it didn't. The small schools of choice seems to have worked, but they had already abandoned it, so they didn't pivot back to it. They had pretty much already abandoned measuring effective teachers. Here, the intervention was, let's come up with a way of using test scores in combination with classroom observations and student surveys to identify who are the effective teachers and what the effective approaches of teachers are, what works and doesn't work for teachers. And let's use that for compensation, for employment, and for training of teachers. In other words, they wanted to build a robot that would, detect good teachers and good teaching, and then the robot could reward the good teachers and good teaching and train future good teachers and good teaching. That was the idea. But yeah, there you could see that in the evaluation that they commissioned, and they deserve credit for having commissioned an evaluation of their own effort. They have mostly negative outcomes to show, from more than $500 million in expenditure.
Yeah, so it did the opposite of what they wanted, or mostly nothing and bunch of negatives.
Yeah, it's mostly negatives. But it's mostly noise, actually.
Yeah, a bunch of zeros and
a lot of zeros. Yeah, but
so what do you think? Ed reformers should do. People in this space. With the possibility of, perhaps with these recessionary cuts and perhaps, some of these foundations are seeing that a lot of what they're investing in isn't really producing outcomes. What should people kind of take away from that?
Well, so the thing is that because education is a highly personal thing where different people legitimately are going to have different goals and different preferences, then the solutions are really going to be found by individuals and not by governments and big foundations, right? Because there isn't a uniform solution. There are many different solutions for many different people. And so people are kind of figuring this out and solving this on their own. And one of the amazing things about the pandemic is it has forced a lot of people to figure out what they think works for them. And it's difficult, it's unpleasant, it's very hard on people, I understand. But it's also been a chance for people to reflect a little bit on what's important to them. What do their children really need? How can they best provide that to their children? So, there are some silver linings out of this whole negative experience, and I think that's one of them. And we may come out of this whole experience with a more bottom-up led education reform movement. So the movement will still be there in the sense that things will continue to innovate and improve, but it won't be a movement with a handful of foundations and the government hiring an army of people to sit around, like in dorm room bull sessions between bong hits, dreaming about how everything is supposed to be organized, because a lot of these conversations among education reform people really feel like the kinds of conversations you'd have in your dorm room in college about how like everyone ought to live in little apartments above bodegas with light rail running down the middle of the street, because after all, like whatever life you have at that moment is the life that really everyone wants.
Right.
Even with 3 kids and a dog, no, they shouldn't live in suburbs. I know how cities should be built and what streets look like and what houses should live, and you dream it up. when you're young and in college, you should be forgiven for having these kinds of, because you're smart and you're trying to like dream up how things might be organized. But what people lack when they're young is wisdom. And they lack the wisdom to realize that not everybody has the same dreams and priorities and needs that you do. And so how they're going to want to structure their life is going to be different. And so no matter how smart you are sitting around in your dorm room, you can't dream up how everyone's life is going to be run. It's just too hard. I mean, I could barely dream up how I'm supposed to run my life. That's really hard.
So Jay, have you thought through what that looks like in practice? What does
this bottom up?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So,
and if the answer is no, that's okay.
I don't know exactly, but I think that what we had was the seeding of a whole bunch of advocacy organizations, basically run by kind of smart people who wanted to do good. I think a lot of those organizations are going to have a hard time meeting their budgets. They're going to have a hard time raising the money they need, and they're going to shrink or close. And instead, I think what you're going to see are more parents are going to form groups with each other, and they're going to hire some people to help lead their group. So there'll still be employment in this, and there'll still be leadership, but they're going to want people to help them figure out, how do I design a curriculum for this kind of school that I think meets the needs of my kid and other people in my group who share this? And I think that's where you're going to see more ed reform leadership is going to be in different kind of cooperatives.
Very decentralized.
It'll be decentralized, but it'll be, people will have a demand for how they want to run the education of their children, and they're going to form groups with others who share a similar interest, and they're going to hire leadership. And then there are also going to be entrepreneurs who come in and try to convince parents that they have a vision for how things might work well for their kids, and see if they can get people to join their groups and receive dues from those people in exchange for advice and services. That's where I think so.
Yeah. So I know you said that, there'll be a lot of different approaches, tried from the bottom up, but what do you think might be some overall trends post-pandemic? Do you think, maybe homeschooling will see an uptick? If so, by how much? Maybe virtual schooling, and just maybe even the public schools will start using more, technology maybe? What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I think there will be some uptick, some small uptick in homeschooling. I think Corey, your
super scientific poll.
Right. No, I think there'll be some, because I think some people will discover that their kids are happier and more successful under current arrangements. And they'll also discover it's something that they surprise themselves as parents that they're able to do. And they're going to want to keep doing that because they were essentially forced to try something. And some of them are going to discover they like it and want to keep doing it. And I think that's going to happen. But I think most people are not going to want to do that because a lot of people legitimately have a lot of other demands on their time and their attention. A lot of people don't feel capable of doing this. They don't know how to do it. They want to hire effectively someone else to do it. I mean, this is how I feel about my car, right? I don't want to fix my car. I want to hire someone to fix my car because I don't know anything about it. I don't feel capable of doing that. And there's nothing wrong with people wanting to hire someone else to help educate their children, but it should be consistent with what they prefer and what their values are. So I think people might be a little bit more discriminating and careful shoppers about whether the education is in line with what they really want. And again, this whole experience may give them better perspective on that. But a lot of people are just going to return to the status quo ante. Don't count out inertia. It's a pretty powerful force.
It's interesting, Jay, on this note, I just heard this the other day, and it's not just in North Carolina, which is the example that I'll give.
Uh-huh.
But I want to say it was the State Board of Education. It may have been the legislature. I don't know. Has said that schools in public schools in North Carolina, whether charter or district, must plan for, not instruct, but plan for 5 days a year to be of instruction to be delivered virtually or distance, whatever that looks like, right? And so that's interesting. That's just one out of North Carolina, one example. Here in Arizona, where I am, Kathy Hoffman, who is the superintendent of public instruction, has in several public appearances made kind of off the cuff comments about similar types of measures that would be thrown out and or that could be implemented. And so what's interesting is, you're right. I 100% agree with you. Inertia is a very strong force, and don't count it out, right? But I think we'll see little Band-Aids being put on here and there by the status quo system.
Well, also, it's going to take a while for the status quo to return. No one's going to ring a bell and this is all going to be over. This is going to unfold gradually over.
All right, 30 kids back in a classroom. Everyone's happy with that.
Have you seen those videos, Jay, with the desks 20 feet apart, or they said they're supposed to be 6 feet apart?
Look, the pressure for schools to reopen is enormous, primarily for childcare reasons. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I have to say, though, that the kind of two things I heard the most as schools were closing down, the thing that people were most commenting on and anxious about was how we're going to feed kids and who's going to take care of them while I work. Okay. Which told me, at least initially, these are two really of the top goals for our traditional school system is, custodial care and food. And by the way, those are also traditionally parental responsibilities, right? Traditionally, that's what parents did, is they raised their children and washed them and they fed them. But the state has taken this role for a lot of people, and a lot of people had a very hard time figuring out how they were going to function if the state didn't do this thing for them. And it was only later that we heard a lot of people starting to talk about learning loss and whether learning loss would be big or small, whether it would be exacerbate gaps significantly or not. But early on, the discussion was really all about custodial care and food.
Yeah.
So the pressure for custodial care and food to come back is super high. And I think it's going to come back one way or another. That's going to happen. The learning part may take longer to come back because it's going to be very difficult for the people working in schools. There are a lot of challenges here to work out, and they'd really, Rick Hess had a very good piece out with John Bailey recently, saying basically schools have no alternative but to start planning for how they're going to do it. They can't wait for the all clear siren. They have to just start planning. And I can tell you with the University of Arkansas, and as I'm sure is true at most other universities, we're planning, right? We're coming up with plans, and who knows if they'll work or not, and who knows whether the kids will learn or not. But if we don't get back in business, everything's going to fall apart. So we have to. So will K-12 schools. But it's not going to look the same for a while. And that will mean that there's a longer period of time for everyone to experiment with alternatives and contemplate different schemes. So we're having a prolonged period of experimentation. So think of it a little bit like a Shakespeare comedy, right? The world gets inverted. Men dress as women, women dress as men, and they fall in love with each other, and paupers fall in love with princes, and so on. And And we all get to explore these different arrangements for some period of time, and there's some safety in the fact that it's just a joke, right? It's because it's a comedy in Shakespeare. But then the world is restored at the end, and everything is returned to how it was before. Some people see Shakespeare's comedies as fundamentally conservative in that it ridicules the alternatives and reinforces the restoration of the status quo. Mm-hmm. But I see actually it as subversive, because this extended period of experimentation with alternative arrangements could give people ideas about how they might really want to do things later on. And I think we're oddly in the midst of a very unusual Shakespeare comedy where the world's been inverted and all sorts of odd things are happening. And not everything is going to return to as it was before, because we are given some chance to reflect and experiment with different arrangements. Mm-hmm. But these experiments that we're doing now aren't true experiments, and they're not true tests of concepts. So like the kind of homeschooling people are doing now is not the kind of homeschooling people normally do. And so some people have rightly said to call this homeschooling is a little bit mistaken. It's forced.
Can't go to the museums.
Right. So, right. And people also had no time to prepare a curriculum or, get materials in place or receive training. I mean, there's a lot of things that are, so it's really hard for people. But again, we're going to come through this having learned and with better perspective, and things won't come back as they were before. And all of this learning and experimenting and change will occur without any blue ribbon commission or scientists telling them what it is that they've learned. People manage to learn on their own and figure it out on their own. Mm-hmm. It's amazing, actually. It's actually wonderful to see people figuring out how to solve problems in their own lives. And they don't all figure it out, and they don't all figure it out well. But this is life, right? We're not perfect. We're imperfect, and we're going to gradually make progress. And I think that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think most people will probably switch back to the regular system, despite my survey result. My survey results also found the vast majority would return to the type of school that they were using. Mm-hmm. I think that largely has to do a lot with just cost, right? I mean, people see it as, like you said, kind of like a daycare and food option that's free, quote unquote, free at the point of delivery. Do you think that maybe this will be an opportunity for school choice, in the sense that maybe people will start figuring out that, well, why is this school system getting my funding when they're not even taking care of my kids right now? What if I could use those funds in the form of an education savings account or something like that, and send them to a micro school, which is, maybe a more personalized, daycare learning environment, whatever you want to call it?
I think that's possible. But again, there's an organized group of people who are employed at the schools, where if you rearranged how that funding flowed, those people wouldn't get that money and they might lose their jobs. And so they're very motivated to figure out how to get that money back to them. And since they're super organized and very keenly aware of how things might affect them, they're likely to win in a political battle. So, most of the time they're going to get the money back, and it's going to return to as it was before, but not every time. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the Shakespeare comedy will continue, and we won't restore everything to as it was before.
So do you have any advice for parents at this time, going through the coronavirus closures, or I don't know, any takeaways that are just
so I don't have a lot of advice. I mean, I just have a lot of empathy and sympathy for parents, and I know that they have a lot of demands on them and how to balance it all. My children are older children. They're all back with us, which is wonderful, so but we're it's a different relationship when they get older than when they're little, and So those challenges aren't trivial, and I don't have a lot of advice for them. I think a lot of people are trying to offer solutions and advice for them, and the beauty of that is that there is a marketplace then for that advice, and people are seeking it out. And they're also seeking out each other to form groups of support for each other. I mean, one of the people I follow on social media, Bethany Mendel, I don't know, you know her probably.
Yeah.
But, she's a homeschooler previously, and I see, there's kind of a group of people who've had experience with homeschooling, helping out other people who are now forced into this homeschooling-like arrangement to help them figure out their routines and curriculum and so on. And so those are the people that I would talk to, as opposed to social scientists have relatively little to tell. But people with actual practical experience like Bethany, those are the people probably who are more useful in this kind of circumstance.
Well, but you're, and I won't put words in your mouth, Jay. So I'll use my own, because I think we're on the same page here. You just kind of alluded to that, and we talked a little about it before we went live. But maybe the best piece of advice, at least that I could give to anyone, not as a ed policy, not on anything on education related matters, but just going through the situation that we are as a dad, I would say enjoy the time with your kids, and improve your relationships and spend time with them. And so, again, I won't put words in your mouth, but
no, you said it beautifully. Actually, I wish I had said those words.
I've just found, and I work, right, and I get to come to my office where I have plenty of social distancing. I got 6 feet all the way around me, but so I don't work from home with my kids around me all the time, although a lot of folks have been made to do that. However, because they're not in school and they do have a little more time on their hands in the evenings, I have been able to spend a little more time with them. And so I'm with you on that. I think it's actually been kind of nice for me as a dad,
I think there are many objectively horrible things happening right now. Mm-hmm. But it's also important to try to get some perspective on some of the good things that we might be able to get out of this whole experience. And one of the important ones is pausing, reflecting, and gaining some perspective on what really matters. And I think that's a big part of what education is about anyway, is clarifying what really matters to you and your family and the people around you who you care about, and seeing if you can't achieve those things together. And so this is a real opportunity to do that. And I think a lot of people are doing that. I mean, a lot of people can't. And I understand the luxurious position I'm in that I'm able to have this pausing and reflecting. But to the extent that people can, this can be a very, very beneficial experience where they will come out with improved relationships and improved perspective on what really matters in their life.
Yep. Great. Well, hey, we've already kept you longer than you promised to stay. So
this has been wonderful. I'd love to come back. I just missed chatting with you guys. So this is
it's awesome.
So do you have any concluding thoughts on any of the topics? You just had a pretty beautiful concluding topic about families getting together. So
you'll just have to bring me back. Bring me back again, and then we'll see if we can't come up with a bunch of new interesting things to say.
Yep, cool. I'm sure there will be plenty. So
it'll be great.
Thanks for coming on, Jay. Appreciate your time.
Yep. So thanks for all the listeners for coming out. This was Jay Greene from the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. Until next time, this is the Educational Freedom Institute podcast. In conversation with Jay Greene, Matthew Nielsen, and myself, Corey DeAngelis. We'll see you again on this Friday with our next guest. Have a good one.
Thanks.